I realized she was not scrolling on her phone. She was only looking at the screen, as if something inside it decided all of her emotions for the day. That look was not hurried, not impatient, but quiet, patient, and carried a trace of despair that was hard to notice unless you looked long enough. That afternoon in Seattle, the rain was very light. The small cafe in Capitol Hill had only a few people. Outside the glass, the city blurred like a painting that had not yet dried. I sat at the corner table alone, with a cup of coffee already more than half cold. I came here not to work, not to meet anyone. I just wanted to sit in a place where I could watch life pass by without being pulled into it. Then I saw her. She sat at a table near the window. A beige coat, hair neatly tied back, her face slightly tilted toward the light. The phone rested in her hand, but her finger did not move. She only looked. Looked as if she were waiting for something very important. I did not know her name. I did not know her story. But I knew that feeling. I had once looked at my phone the same way. She lifted the phone. The screen lit up, then went dark. She placed it on the table, then picked it up again. Each time, her eyes changed very slightly. A little hope, a little disappointment, a little effort to look normal. I looked away, then looked back. Not out of curiosity, but because I realized I was seeing a part of my own past in her present. I had once sat like that. I had once waited like that. I had once believed that if I were patient enough, that person would remember me. Her phone vibrated lightly. I saw her shoulders tense slightly. She opened the screen. In just 1 second, her eyes darkened. Then she turned off the screen, placed the phone down, as if she did not want anyone to see that disappointment. I knew it was not the message she was waiting for. In that moment, I realized her greatest conflict was not with that person, but with herself. One part of her wanted to let go. Another part still tried to hold on. I took the last sip of my coffee. It was more bitter than usual. Not because of the coffee, but because of the helpless feeling of seeing someone trapped in a waiting that had no destination. She looked out the window. The rain fell evenly. The drops slid down the glass like streams of thoughts no one touched. I wondered, if I stood up and walked out of the cafe, would she still continue to wait like that? And if I stayed, would anything change? I did not want to interfere, but I also did not want to keep pretending that I did not see. She picked up her phone again, this time, longer. Then she breathed out very softly, a breath so light that if I had not watched carefully, I would not have noticed. In that moment, I understood. She was not waiting for a message. She was waiting for the feeling of being chosen. I asked myself how long it had been since I last asked what I was waiting for. Finally, she placed the phone face down on the table. That was the first action I saw from her that did not move toward waiting. But immediately after that, her hand still rested on the back of the phone, as if afraid it might disappear. I stood up and walked to the counter to pay. When I returned to get my coat, I looked at her one more time. She was still sitting there, still quiet. But in her eyes, there was something very fragile. I did not talk to her. I did not walk over. I only walked outside, leaving behind a story that had not yet found its first words. But I knew. From that moment on, I was no longer an outsider. And my story, in truth, also began from her waiting. That night, I returned to my small apartment in Ballard with the sound of rain tapping on the car roof. Seattle at night always makes people feel as if they are living inside a slightly wet and cold dream. I opened the door, turned on the light, and the room lit up just enough to show its emptiness. Nothing had changed. But I had. I put my coat on the chair, placed the keys on the table, and stood still for a few seconds. In my mind, the image of the girl in the cafe was still there. Not her face, but her eyes. I had never talked to her. Yet it felt as if I had touched a very real part of her story. I sat on the bed and picked up my phone out of habit. The screen showed a list of old conversations. I scrolled very slowly, not to look for anyone, but to realize that I had once been just like her. One name appeared. I did not open it. I only looked. A name that once made me wake up in the middle of the night just to check for a new message. A name I once believed would return if I were patient enough. I put the phone down. This time, not face down. I just let it lie there. I stepped out onto the small balcony. The rain was still falling evenly. Streetlights reflected on the wet road like memories that refused to dry. I wondered, if I had met Emma a few years earlier, would I have seen her as a stranger? Or would I have recognized myself in her immediately? I once waited for someone. Not loudly, not with blame. I waited in silence. I waited by convincing myself that the person was just busy. I waited by hiding my pain inside ordinary sentences. It's okay. I'm fine. Maybe tomorrow that person will message. I lived inside those sentences for a long time. The memory returned very clearly. One night I sat on my bed, yellow light on the wall. The phone lay in my hand. The screen was dark. I waited for a small vibration. Just one vibration was enough to make me believe I still had a place in someone's heart. But that night, like many other nights, nothing came. I did not cry. I only felt myself disappearing very slowly. I understood Emma's feeling in that moment. I understood because I had once stood in exactly that place. People do not wait because they are foolish. They wait because they have placed too many memories into one person. I walked back into the room, sat on the chair, and looked into the empty space in front of me. I realized that waiting does not only take away time, it also takes away the ability to live in the present. I wondered, if at that time someone had looked at me the way I had looked at Emma, would I have been less lost? I remembered her eyes when the phone screen turned dark. Those eyes were not only sad, they also carried self-blame. As if she was thinking she was not good enough to be chosen. I felt angry for her, and also angry for my past self. We often blame ourselves more than we blame the person who left. We believe that if we were a little different, a little better, that person would not have left us behind. I once believed that, and perhaps Emma was believing that too. I picked up my phone again. This time I opened that old conversation, not to send a message, only to look. The old messages were still there, like a museum of things that once existed. I realized that what hurts people is not losing someone. It is losing the image of themselves when they were with that person. I closed the conversation. I did not delete it. But I did not open it again. I lay down on the bed looking at the ceiling. In my mind, there was no longer the image of the person from the past. There was only the image of Emma in the cafe. She did not know me. But I already knew a lot about her just through the way she waited. I wondered, if I met her again tomorrow, would I have the courage to say that I understood? Or would I continue to be a safe observer? I did not have the answer. But I knew this story was no longer only Emma's. It had touched the deepest part of me. Before sleeping, I placed my phone on the table, far from my reach. A small action, but it was the first time I did it without feeling anxious. And I understood. Perhaps, to understand another person's pain, sometimes we have to walk through our own path one more time. The next morning, I returned to the cafe in Capitol Hill. I had no clear reason. I only knew that I wanted to see the place where I had seen Emma. As if by standing in the right spot, I could understand better what had been in her eyes that day. The cafe was the same. The smell of roasted coffee, the sound of spoons touching cups, some people working on laptops, some people looking out the window. I chose the same table. Not because it was familiar, but because I wanted to keep the position of the observer. Emma was not there. I did not feel disappointed. I only felt empty. The feeling was like reading a book halfway and turning the next page only to realize it had been torn out. I ordered an Americano. When the barista placed the cup down, I suddenly realized I was looking at the tabletop, not at the person in front of me. I was waiting for something that I did not dare to name. I opened my phone. There were no messages, no important notifications, only very ordinary things. And for the first time in many years, I realized the feeling of waiting does not always need a specific person. Sometimes, people only wait for something that makes them feel less empty. I closed my eyes for a few seconds. Emma's image appeared very clearly. Not her smile, not her face, but the moment she turned off her phone screen, I understood. There are actions smaller than words, but they say more than any story. I wondered what she had been thinking at that moment. Had she blamed him? Or blamed herself? Or blamed both? And I also wondered, if I were her, what I would have done differently. I left the cafe after nearly an hour, carrying a feeling that had not yet been closed. Seattle in the morning had very pale sunlight. I walked slowly along a small street. In my mind, there was no longer the image of a specific person. There was only the idea of waiting. I realized, people do not only wait for messages. They wait to be proven that they are not forgotten. In the afternoon, while I was sitting and reading in my apartment, my phone vibrated. A message from an unknown number. Is this Finn? I looked at the screen for a long time. Then I replied, yes. A few seconds later, another message appeared. It's Emma. I'm sorry if I'm bothering you, but I've been thinking a lot since yesterday. I put the book down. In my chest, there was a very light feeling. Not excitement, not happiness, but an acceptance that some meetings are not to begin a relationship, but to begin a truth. I replied, it's okay, I'm listening. Emma typed slowly, each line as if every word had to pass through a layer of hesitation. I realized I have waited for someone for too long. I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe because you looked at me without judging. I read each line. I did not know whether to comfort or to stay silent, and I chose a third way. Honesty. I didn't judge because I've been there. Emma was silent for a few minutes. Then she wrote, so what did you do then? I looked at the screen. I knew this answer would not be pleasant, but it was the only true one. I did nothing. I just waited until I could no longer stand it. Emma replied almost immediately, I'm afraid I'm doing the same. I closed my eyes. I clearly saw my own image inside that sentence. You don't have to be like me, I wrote. You only need to be honest with your feelings. Emma did not reply immediately. After a while, she sent only one very short sentence. I'm tired. Only 2 words. But enough for me to understand, I replied. Being tired is very real. But you don't have to be tired alone. Emma sent a very small emoji. Not smiling, not crying, just a quiet face. I put my phone down. I looked out the window. The sun was setting behind the low buildings. Pale orange light covered the city like a very gentle goodbye. I realized that in life there are people we only need to meet once to open a door inside us. Not to step in, but to see ourselves more clearly. I did not know where Emma would go after those messages. I did not know whether she would let go or continue to wait. But I knew that at least she had begun to ask questions. And to me, that was already a change. That night I did not wait for any messages. I only left my phone on the table. And I thought of Emma. Not as someone who was waiting, but as someone who was beginning to look back at herself. 3 days after Emma's last message, I did not receive any more from her. Not because I was expecting them, but because I realized I was still paying attention. I did not check my phone more often, but every time the screen lit up, I still glanced at it very quickly, like an old reflex that had not yet died. Seattle entered its rare sunny days. The city looked lighter, but inside me, the feeling of something unfinished still stayed in a small corner, just enough to keep me from feeling completely at ease. That afternoon I went out for a walk. I had no destination. I just wanted to leave my apartment to hear the sound of my own footsteps on the sidewalk. I passed small shops, familiar restaurants, park benches still holding traces of sunlight. Then I saw Emma. She sat alone on a wooden bench near the lake. Her coat was thinner than before. Her hair fell softly. She was not holding her phone. Her hands rested on her lap, eyes looking at the water. That look was no longer as tense as the first time I saw her. But it was not completely peaceful either. I stopped a few steps behind her. I did not know whether I should move forward or turn away. But then Emma turned her head. She saw me before I could decide. Her eyes showed a brief surprise. Then she smiled very lightly. Do you come here often too? She asked, like the first time we talked. But this time her voice was no longer unfamiliar. I was just walking by, I said. But it seems I always walk by places where you are. Emma smiled softly. Not because my sentence was beautiful, but perhaps because in that moment, she felt she was not completely invisible. I sat down beside her, at a distance just enough not to make her feel invaded. We looked at the lake. The wind was very gentle. The water formed small circles. Are you okay? I asked slowly. Emma did not answer immediately. She took a breath, then let it out. I don't know what to call this feeling, she said. It's not as painful as before, but it's not light either. I understood. There are sadnesses that are no longer sharp, but still heavy. Are you still waiting? I asked. Emma looked down at her hands. Then she shook her head very slightly. I'm not waiting for messages anymore, she said. But I'm still waiting for the feeling that I did the right thing. That sentence made me silent. Because I knew people do not only wait for others, they also wait for their own forgiveness. Emma told me that the night after she texted me, she reopened the old conversation. She read it from beginning to end, not to remember, but to see how she herself had changed. I realized, she said, at first I talked a lot. Then I talked less. Then I only asked questions. And finally, I only waited. Her voice did not blame. It only told. I looked at Emma, and inside me, there was a very quiet respect. Because to see that, one must be brave enough to look directly at oneself. Are you angry with him? I asked. Emma thought for a long time. Then she shook her head. I'm not angry. I'm just sad that I didn't leave earlier. That sentence was not loud, but it fell into me like a small stone, enough to create ripples. We were silent for a while. The wind passed over the lake, carrying a very light water smell. I realized that in this silence, there was no longer waiting. There was only presence. Finn, Emma called my name very softly. Do you think I'm weak? I turned to look at her. I think you are very strong, I said. Because you dare to look back at yourself. Emma said nothing, but her eyes became slightly wet, not with falling tears, but with a softening. Last night, she said, I put my phone on the table, and for the first time, I didn't touch it for 2 hours. I smiled, not because it was a big victory, but because it was a very real step. I don't know how long it will take me to completely stop remembering, Emma continued. But I know I don't want to live in waiting anymore. I nodded. I did not advise. I did not encourage. I only stayed there. We stood up at the same time, walked along the small path by the lake, not talking much, but every step felt lighter. Before we parted, Emma turned back to look at me. You know, she said, I used to think people must be loved to have value. But now I think, maybe people must first not abandon themselves. I looked at her, and I understood. That was the moment she began to leave, waiting. Emma walked ahead. I stood and watched, not with a feeling of loss, but with a very strange feeling. Peace. I knew Emma's story had not ended, but it had turned in another direction. And in that moment, I realized, sometimes what people need is not a message, but one moment brave enough to stop waiting. After that afternoon by the lake, I did not see Emma for nearly a week. There were no messages, no calls, no signs that she was still thinking about me. But strangely, I did not feel empty as before. I only felt that I was in a very real, quiet space where I was no longer trying to look for anything from others. Seattle became colder. The wet streets reflected the lights like scattered fragments of memory. I went to work, came home, read books, walked. Life did not change. But I did. I realized I no longer held my phone out of habit whenever I sat down. I no longer checked the screen when I heard a vibration from afar. Old reflexes were slowly dying, very slowly, but very clearly. That afternoon I went up to Cary Park. Not to look for Emma. I only wanted to stand in a high place where the city looked smaller, to remind myself that some pains also need to be seen from a distance. The wind was strong. Space Needle appeared faint in the thin mist. I stood near the railing, both hands in my coat pockets. My mind had no clear thoughts, only a very light feeling, as if I were standing between two versions of myself. Then I heard a voice behind me. Finn? I turned around. Emma was standing there. She wore a dark coat. Her hair was tied neatly. Her face no longer had the familiar tired look. Not bright, but calm. I wasn't sure if you would still remember me, she said. I smiled. I remember. We stood facing each other, between the wind and the city. Neither of us stepped closer. But that distance no longer felt distant. Emma said, I've been thinking a lot since the day by the lake. I nodded. I did not ask what she had thought. I let her speak. I realized that before, I always needed someone else to confirm that I had value, she continued. And when that person was silent, I felt like I disappeared. I looked at her. I did not interrupt. I knew these sentences had passed through many nights. But these past days, Emma slowed her voice. I started to practice living whether someone still remembered me. She smiled very lightly. Not because she was happy, but because she had seen something new. I'm still sad, she said, but I'm not panicking anymore. That sentence made my throat feel slightly dry. because I understood that between sadness and panic, there is a very large distance. We stood side by side, looking down at the city. The wind blew stronger. I could clearly hear the sound of leaves hitting each other behind us. "You know," Emma said, "the hardest thing is not accepting that someone will not come back. It is accepting that I waited too long." I nodded. "I know." Emma looked at me. "You didn't ask whether I would go back to him." I shook my head. "Because I know the answer is no longer important." She was silent for a few seconds. Then she nodded. "I didn't text back," Emma said. "And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was missing anything." I breathed out slowly, not because I felt relieved for her, but because I saw something very real happening. "I think," Emma continued, "before, I wasn't waiting for him. I was waiting for the feeling I once had when I was with him." That sentence made me turn to look at her. And in that moment, I understood. Emma had gone very far from the starting point. We did not talk more about that person. That name no longer needed to appear. It had completed its role in the story. Emma turned to me. "Finn," she said, "if that day you hadn't looked at me that way, maybe I would still be sitting in that cafe." I shook my head. "You walked out by yourself. I was only standing there." Emma smiled. This time that smile had light. We left Cary Park at the same time, walked down the small slope. Neither of us spoke much, but every step felt very clear. Before we parted, Emma stopped. "I don't know where I will go," she said, "but I know I don't want to go back to the old place." I looked at her. "That is enough." Emma nodded, then she turned away. Her back was straighter. Not because of confidence, but because she no longer bent down. I stood and watched. Inside me there was no feeling of loss, only a very light feeling. I had just witnessed someone walk out of her own waiting. After the meeting at Cary Park, Emma and I did not text each other every day anymore. Not because of distance, but because we both understood that some stages need to be lived alone, so that we do not turn another person into a new support for old wounds. I returned to my familiar rhythm of life. Work, quiet evenings, the streets of Seattle gradually becoming familiar with my footsteps. But inside me, there was a very different feeling. I no longer looked at everything as empty spaces that needed to be filled. One evening, while I was sitting by the window reading, my phone vibrated. It was Emma. "Finn, can I call you?" I looked at the message for a few seconds and then replied, "Yes." Emma's voice on the other end was not shaking, but very light. Light like someone trying to keep herself calm. "I just received a message from him," she said. I did not ask who. I knew. I did not say anything. I let Emma have space to continue. "He said he is getting married," Emma said slowly. "He wrote very politely, very calmly, as if there had never been anything between me and him." In that moment, I felt my throat go dry. Not because of surprise, but because I knew there are sentences that do not shock, but break. Emma was silent for a few seconds. Then she continued. "At first, I didn't cry. I just looked at the screen for a long time. Then I asked myself why I had once waited for someone who could write those words to me." I took a deep breath. "How do you feel?" I asked. "I feel light," Emma answered. "Lighter than I expected, but also sad in another way." I understood. There are sadnesses that do not make people collapse, but make them wake up. Emma said she had read that message many times. Not to feed hope, but to make sure she no longer had a reason to wait. "I think," she said, "if he had texted to come back, maybe I would still be confused. But because he texted to end it, I could see more clearly." I did not know whether that was luck or not, but I knew it was the truth. "Did you reply?" I asked. Emma was silent. Then she said, "I only texted one sentence. I wish you happiness." I closed my eyes. I imagined that moment. One short sentence, but the ending of many long nights. "You know," Emma said, "when I sent that sentence, my hand was shaking. But inside, I was very calm. I said nothing. I only let that calm spread to me." "I don't hate him," Emma continued. "I'm just sad that I once placed my whole world into someone who did not carry my world with him." That sentence made something very deep in my chest move. "You are not wrong," I said. "You only loved in the way you knew." Emma smiled very softly. "But now," she said, "I want to learn how to love without turning myself into someone who waits." We were silent together. I could clearly hear Emma's breathing on the other end. Not fast, not heavy, just the breath of someone who had just walked through a door. Finn! Emma called my name. Thank you. For what? I asked. For not pulling me out, she said. You only stood there so I could walk by myself. I did not know how to answer, because I understood that was not my credit. After the call, I sat quietly for a long time. The city outside the window was already lit. The lights reflected on the glass like low stars. I realized that sometimes what people need is not someone to save them, but someone who does not step in while they are learning to save themselves. That night, I put my phone down, not because I no longer cared, but because I believed that Emma could walk forward on her own. And in that trust, I felt that I was also walking out of an old part of myself. After the phone call that night, I no longer thought of Emma as someone who was being worried about. I thought of her as someone who was moving, not standing still. That difference was very small, but it changed everything inside me. In the following days, we texted very little. Not because we ran out of things to say, but because we no longer needed words to fill empty spaces. Emma's messages were shorter, clearer, and no longer carried hesitation. One morning she texted, "Today I signed up for a new class." I replied, "Good." Only 2 words. But I knew it was no longer an impulsive decision. It was a step. In the afternoon, I went to Green Lake Park. The sky was cloudy. The wind was light. The lake surface was calmer than usual. I walked slowly around the lake, feeling each step, as if I were also learning how not to hurry. I saw Emma on the familiar bench. She was reading a book. Her phone was in her coat pocket, not in her hand. That image made me stop for a few seconds before walking over. Emma looked up, saw me, and smiled. "Did you walk by again by coincidence?" she asked. "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe the city is leading us in the same direction." Emma nodded. She closed her book and put it aside. "I feel like I'm learning how to live slowly," she said. "Before, I only lived to wait." I sat down beside her. The distance between us was close enough to talk, but not close enough to create any expectations. "Do you miss him?" I asked. Emma thought for a long time. Then she nodded. "Yes," she said. "But I don't want to go back." I looked at the lake. The wind made the water ripple slightly. "I realized," Emma continued, "missing someone doesn't mean I have to walk toward them." That sentence made me turn to look at her. In Emma's eyes, there was no longer conflict, only acceptance. "I used to think that if I stopped missing him, it meant I had never truly loved," she said. "But now I understand. Loving truly means daring to leave memories behind." I said nothing. I only listened, because I knew those sentences did not need a reply. We were silent together for a long time. Not a heavy silence, but the silence of 2 people standing safely on their own sides. "Finn," Emma said softly, "have you ever been afraid that when you no longer wait for anyone, you will feel very empty?" I thought. Then I answered, "I was afraid, but I realized emptiness is only a place to put yourself back." Emma looked at me. Her eyes were very calm. "I like that sentence," she said. We stood up together, walked along the path. The wind moved through the trees. Leaves fell very lightly. Emma walked half a step slower than me, not because she was weak, but because she was looking more carefully at each step. "Finn," she said, "if one day I love someone again, I don't want to love by waiting." I nodded. "You will love by being present." Emma smiled. This time, her smile carried no past. We stopped at a fork in the path. Emma turned to me. "I don't know what the future will be like," she said. "But I know that now, I am no longer the person waiting in that cafe." I looked at her, and in that moment, I understood. Emma was no longer the main character of a sad story. She had become the one who continued her own life. Emma turned onto another path. I stood and watched. There was no feeling of loss, only a very clear feeling. I had just witnessed someone step out of their old version. I turned and continued walking. For the first time in a long while, I did not think about what I was waiting for. I only thought about the fact that I was walking. And in that moment, I understood. When a person learns how not to wait anymore, they do not lose love. They only move love back to its right place. After that afternoon at Green Lake Park, I did not see Emma for a long time. Not because we avoided each other, but because we were both living in our own rhythms, no longer needing the presence of the other to confirm that we were still moving forward. Seattle entered autumn more clearly. Leaves fell more. The cold came faster. The city carried a strange gentleness, as if it was also learning to let go of what had passed. I returned to the cafe in Capitol Hill on a weekend morning, not to look for Emma, but to sit again at the place where my story had begun. I chose the old table, ordered the same coffee. But this time, I no longer sat as a person observing someone else's sadness. I sat as a person observing myself. I placed my phone on the table, the screen face down. My hand did not rest on it. And I realized that my body no longer tightened because of that habit. I remembered Emma's eyes the first time we met. Then I remembered her eyes the last time we met. Those two looks were not the same, but both were real. I understood. People do not change in one moment. They change in many small moments in which they dare to stay with themselves. I took a sip of coffee. The bitterness was still there, but it no longer bothered me. I suddenly realized that some things do not need to be sweet to be accepted. My phone vibrated. I did not flinch. I did not hurry. I looked at the screen calmly. It was Emma. "Finn, today I went to an interview for a new job." I smiled. Then I replied, "Good luck." Emma wrote back, "I'm not afraid anymore." Only 4 words. But I knew they were the result of many nights. Typed, "I believe in you." After a while, Emma wrote, "You know, I just walked past that cafe." I paused for a second. "Did you go in?" I asked. "No," Emma replied. "I only looked through the glass, and I saw the me from before sitting inside. But I don't want to go back and sit with her anymore." I read that sentence very slowly, not because it was hard to understand, but because I understood it too well. "Do you regret it?" I asked. Emma replied after a few minutes. "I don't regret it. I only feel compassion." I looked out the window. Yellow leaves lay on the sidewalk. Everything was very quiet. I realized that people do not truly leave the past. They only learn to look at it with different eyes. That afternoon, I walked for a long time, without purpose, without a specific direction. I just let myself walk through the city as a part of it. I thought of Emma, but not of her sad story. I thought of how she had walked out by herself, and I realized that I had also walked out of a very old part of myself. I was no longer the person sitting in a cafe only to observe. I was also no longer the person keeping distance from all emotions. I was learning how to be present. When night came, I went home, put my keys on the table, hung my coat, opened the window. Cold wind filled the room. I placed my phone on the table, not face down, not open. Just left it there, like an ordinary object. I realized that for the first time in a long while, I no longer defined the value of a day by whether someone had messaged me or not. Before going to sleep, I looked at the city one last time. Lights stretched out like an endless flow. I thought of Emma, not as someone who once waited, but as someone who dared to leave. I thought of myself, not as someone who once stood outside other people's lives, but as someone who was learning to step into his own life. And in that moment, I understood. We do not need a message to know we have value. We only need one moment brave enough to stop waiting. Emma's story ended there. My story did too. Not because everything was perfect, but because we had stopped waiting in order to begin living.